Hotel and welcome. Kemetic legacy today. Kemetic legacy today. Life, health, and strength to you all. Kemetic legacy today. Hotep. Kemetic legacy today.
Hetepu. Welcome to Kemetic Legacy Today, your weekly journal of ancient African, ancient Kemetic history and spirituality. My name is Jabari Osaze, also known as Heru Jeden Ma'at Aten Ra.
And my name is Anika Daniels Osaze, also known as Nfrka Ma'at.
Today we have a special treat for you at home. It's rare that we are able to have one of the individuals who is truly responsible for us being here in many ways as well. There are those individuals that came forth several decades ago, please don't beat me up for saying that, and really spurred on this interest in understanding who we were as an African people. And it's not often that we get to stand and speak with them because unfortunately many of them are no longer with us. But we are very lucky today to be able to have one of those, I'd say, warrior scholars, one of those people who have blazed the path for many of us to walk along, Dr. Leonard Jeffries. And so today, we're lucky enough to be able to have a lecture by Dr. Jeffries, and then we'll do an interview of him afterwards. We're really excited to be able to have him on the show.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
I remember all the conferences we used to go to visit you and see how everything was going. So.
Yes. Seems like a long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago, right?
No, not at all.
So for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Jeffries, please understand that this gentleman has been blazing the trail along the wonderful field of Africana studies for over 40 years, where he has been at the City College of New York. Those of you who are living in New York City know that the City College of New York is not only one of New York City's premier educational institutions, but if you're not familiar with it outside of New York City, you really need to see what's going on there, because we've been able to create a top-notch institution in the village of Harlem. And so Dr. Jeffries has been one of the most important faculty, administrators, and strategists for this institution for 40 years now.
Founder and chair.
Yes, chairing the Africana Studies department there for a long time. And also I know that you're not only the professor of Africana Studies, but also political science as well.
Yes.
And so he's brought together two of the most important fields that people of African descent need to focus on in order to figure out exactly what we need to be doing here in the current day. So we're pleased once again to have you here.
My pleasure.
And so could you talk to us about what you're going to talk to our audience about this evening?
Well, certainly. This evening we'll have a chance to engage in an understanding of what we refer to as intellectual warfare, the struggle for the truth about African peoples. And we will have images, and we'll be able to focus on three important dimensions. One is the question of epistemology. How do you know what you know? And the other is chronology. What is the timeline you're operating under in reference to that knowledge? And the third is axiology, the value systems that relate to the knowledge. And so when we deal with those three, we are able to see the Africanness of the global knowledge that we refer to as world knowledge. And we'll be able to see the roots of the knowledge that we have for years been taught has nothing to do with Africa when the foundation is clearly African. So that it will be an attempt to give you a opening on the world and will allow you to be involved in what I refer to, and the students in my classes refer to as self-development. And that self-development needs to be about the pursuit of this enormous truth of who and what we are as African peoples. And it's going to be difficult because we've been programmed away from Africa. And but reprogramming yourself to Africa is the victory. And so that we're on a victorious path.
Wonderful.
And that's why I enjoy teaching And also, the world is our preserve. And I enjoy traveling throughout the world. And wherever I go, the learning process continues, even for myself, who's arrived at a certain plateau.
The plateau that we're all looking to arrive at one point or another.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to keep going like Dr. John Henry Clark,
Wonderful.
who was able to, as a mentor of many of us, continue the work up until he was 86.
Wow.
And his partner, I call them the twin towers
That's right.
of power
That's
and
right,
knowledge
that's right.
and light.
That's right.
In Harlem, his great partner, Dr. Yosef Ben Yakin, and Dr. Ben, he's still, as we speak, leading us in this great victory. And Dr. Ben is at least 92 now. So that we have to understand what has happened over the last, well, I call it the period of the Great Awakening, 1945 to 1995, we can describe as the Great Awakening in terms of the explosion of knowledge, and it's continuing. It's 1945 to 1995 and beyond. And so whenever we have a chance to make our contribution or point out contributions being made, it is another one of those victorious moments for our people.
That's wonderful.
And,
wow, wow. So without further ado, we're going to certainly say, for those of you at home, please enjoy this lecture with the eminent Dr. Leonard Jeffries. And we should also thank the folks here in our studio audience as well. Remember, you could have been in our audience as well. If you had just contacted us and let us know that you're watching Kemetic Legacy today, you would have had an opportunity to commune with Dr. Jeffries. So make sure that you do that as well. So without further ado, Dr. Leonard Jeffries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In the Akan tradition that I'm a part of in West Africa, to thank one, we would say Medase.
Madasi.
And many thanks would be Medase P. So Medase P, many thanks.
Wow.
Medase P.
Thank you. Medase P.
Yeah. Hotep. Hotep is a greeting you'll often hear us use. It's from the language of the Africans of the Nile, the Medu Neter, that we often refer to as the hieroglyphs. And Hotep means peace. And I greet you in that ancient African term that we also have in other cultures, such as in the Hebrew tradition, we would say shalom, peace, and in the Muslim tradition, assalamu alaikum. And of course, in the Christian tradition, peace be unto you. But the first evidence of this question of peace being used as a greeting comes from the traditions of the Africans of the Nile. And I refer to the Nile in referencing the 4,000 miles of this great cultural highway in Africa that originates in the Great Lakes regions in Africa and continues to flow up north until the White Nile and the Blue Nile come together, and then the Atbara River in Ethiopia flows into the valley, and you have this great Nile Valley ecology. And if we want to understand why there was a flowering of culture and civilization, high culture and enormous civilization in the Nile Valley, it is because of this special ecology. From the point of view of geography, the rich soil of Africa is constantly brought to the valley with the annual inundation, the annual flood. And with this flooding of the Nile, you have an ecology of possibilities. You have an ecology of potential. And so Africans were able to take advantage of this enormous ecology and lay the foundations for the most sustained civilization and high culture in human history. And so it's important for us to put this in context, this enormous history, because for most of my life, and certainly many, many centuries before, the history of the Nile Valley was taken out of Africa and deposited somewhere else in the world, in a mythical land called the Middle East. And Africans were cut away from their enormous heritage. And so our great struggle and our great victory has been to restore the Nile Valley to the true peoples who can be proud of its legacy. So when we refer to Kemet and Egypt and Nubia and the Sudan, all of those names relate to this Nile Valley that I'm referencing. But we do have to be more specific and clarify what we mean. The Nile Valley in most instances is referred to as Egypt. And Egypt is an anglicized reference to the Greek name Egyptos. And that refers primarily to the northern part of the Nile Valley. The last few hundred miles when the Nile flows into the delta and then into the Mediterranean Sea. But the Nile is much more than the northern part, which we refer to as Egypt and in earlier times as Kemet, the Black Land, the land of the black people. And when we go further south into Africa, we come into the southern part of Egypt, which is in an area we reference as Nubia. Nubia, Lower Nubia, is the southern part of Egypt. And when you cross the border between Egypt and the Sudan, you get for hundreds of miles into the heartland of Nubia, and that becomes the Upper Egypt. And so, Upper Nubia, forgive the reference. And that area is often not on the radar of intellectual development, and it's not linked. The heartland of Nubia is not linked to the serious development of high culture and civilization in the Nile. So this evening, we want to be able to, in the few minutes we have, link the great developments in the Sudan, which includes most of Nubia, as well as in Egypt, which includes the southern part of Egypt, and relate these great areas. Nubia does not refer to a people. It refers to gold, and Nub is the reference to the land of gold. And so when we refer to this area of the world, which includes Egypt and the Sudan, in ancient times, Kemet, and the various empires and civilizations of Nubia, which would include names like Kush, Kerma, and Napata. And so we need clarification and definition in order to proceed, and that's why I take the time to introduce the nomenclature that we need to refer to. When we refer to the Nile Valley, I like to reclaim this enormous image, the pyramids, because in the culture of the world, there's a myth and a misunderstanding that somehow or other the pyramids were not really a part of African culture. They were built by another ancient people that sojourned in the Nile Valley. And in our biblical traditions, which are founded upon what we refer to as the revealed religions, founded upon Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in our revealed religions, this mythology and unfortunate reference to other people other than Africans building the pyramids needs to be corrected. And in doing so, you may ruffle a few feathers and step on a few toes. A few years ago, when I was asked by the former mayor of New York, Mayor Ed Koch, to come down to his office, I told him I really was not interested in being interviewed by him. And he persisted, and I said, well, if you want to know what I'm teaching, what I'm saying, and what my research is all about, then you need to come up to City College. And he said, he said that would be a media event. But I said, that's where the books are. I have thousands of books in my offices and in the department, and I think it would be preferable for you to come up here. Well, he wouldn't come. I said, well, that's all to the good, because I really am not interested in engaging you unless you're prepared to give up my pyramids. And he said, what? I said, yes, I would like to have my pyramids back as part of the legacy of African peoples. I told him I have a picture of you on a camel floating around the Nile claiming your ancestors built the pyramids thousands of years ago, and there's no evidence for that. In fact, I have another picture of Menachem Begin at the time of the agreements between Egypt and the Camp Davis Accords between Egypt and Israel. And there's a picture of Menachem Begin standing in front of the pyramids in one of the New York papers, in which they are stating that the most significant moment in Menachem Begin's life is not the peace that's being worked out with Egypt, but dancing in front of the pyramids that his ancestors built thousands of years ago. Now, why does Dr. Jeffrey spend so much time in making sure that these institutions are properly in their historical place? Because I want to use these institutions in order to talk about Nile Valley civilization. To his credit, Mayor Koch did call me up a few days after I told him I want my pyramids back, and he said, I think he was in Hawaii or Hong Kong, that Dr. Jeffries, you can have your pyramids back. And so, is that enough for us to get together and talk? And I said, I think we can. And so once he gave my pyramids back, we were able to meet with former Mayor Ed Koch at his office in Rockefeller Center. My brother and I rolled down boxes of books because he wanted to know what it was that we were saying, what it was that we were teaching, and the evidences. And so the Jeffries boys from Newark, New Jersey, Marlon Jeffries, Jeff we call him, and his older brother Leonard Jeffries, Dr. J, I'm affectionately called, went to Rockefeller Center to meet with Mayor Ed Koch, who grew up in Newark, New Jersey. So the three Newarkers were in the office trying to deal with this question of history. And of course, I observe everything, and I'm looking, and I see on his desk a little statue. And then of course, I couldn't resist saying that, Mayor Koch, before we get started in our interaction, I really would like to know, what do you know about the Statue of Liberty, the symbol that you have on your desk? And he said, well, it's the statue for the immigrants, and it's in the harbor in New York. I said, wait a minute, is that based upon any facts and any information that you've seen, or is it just hearsay or just contemporary lack of knowledge? And he said, well, do you have any knowledge? I said, certainly. I said, I've been studying these things for many, many years, if not decades, and the Statue of Liberty has nothing to do with your immigrant forebears. It has to do with my forebears who struggled for liberty in these United States. And then he got excited. He said, I really have me, I could just see his face, and he said, I really have me a doozy here. So in his excitement, he said, just a moment, and he went into another office and came out with 2 tape recorders. And he put one in front of me, one in front of him. He put them in front of us, and he said, one is for you and one is for me. And so, and he also brought in his, one of his legal partners, Attorney Wolf. And so the four of us, Attorney Wolf, Attorney Koch, former mayor of New York, and the Jeffries boys, engaged in a history lesson in his office in Rockefeller Center. And of course, we have a copy of the tape. He gave it to me after an hour or more of interaction. And I'm writing several books now, and I wanted to use the material in the tape. And so we asked him for permission to use the material. And he has written me a letter that he doesn't know anything about any tapes, and he certainly can't give any permission about any tapes that did not exist. And but unfortunately, the copies of the tapes have circulated worldwide, and it was May the 16th, 1990, that I had a chance to interact with the leading member of the Jewish community in New York in an intellectual dialogue. And it was a beautiful experience. I don't regret it. And he said it wasn't a bad experience. His attorney, his partner, Attorney Wolf, said it was very interesting to see the engagement. So when I opened up by saying that by us getting into our history, we step on toes, we need to understand that. And we need to love and appreciate everybody from different backgrounds, different cultures, and different religions. But we shouldn't let our friendships with the various groups prevent us from dealing with this enormous history. And so I claim the pyramids for African peoples, and I have plenty of evidence that they were part of our deep culture. And I also claim when I go to Washington, D.C., and I just came back from a visit to Washington, D.C. on Sunday, I claim the African legacy that is clearly in Washington, D.C. So when I pass something called the Washington Monument, my heart pounds. My head is ready to burst with this clear evidence of African culture in our nation's capital. And so most of us, when we go to Washington, will see an image that's similar to this, but we won't have the knowledge to really explain and relate to it. In fact, we take our young people. I can just see some mother taking her son, Sammy, and her little baby, Mary Jo, down to Washington. Look, Sammy, and look, Mary Jo, at the wonderful monument for George Washington. And the youngsters are impressed, and their mouths drop, and they say, ooh, without a clue that the image that they're looking at comes straight out of the cultures of Africans of the Nile. It's an enormous symbol. It's a symbol of schools of knowledge of African peoples. It's a symbol, first and foremost, of resurrection, rebirth, and regeneration. It's a symbol of deep thoughts in African culture in the Nile, the relationship between the males and the female, the relationship between brothers, the relationship between the human family and God, the relationship between God and the manifestations of God. And the deep philosophical thought is all wrapped in this symbol. The one I have in my hand is located in the great Karnak Temple complex. But most of these symbols of African rebirth, resurrection, and schools of knowledge are located out of Africa than in the Nile Valley itself. There are a dozen of these symbols located in the Vatican, in Rome, in fact, in the heart of Vatican Square, which is an example of a pillared temple complex. In the heart of Vatican Square, a few years ago, the Pope passed on, and they had this ceremony, and there was this symbol with all of its African writings on it, and at the top of it was a cross. And we have to ask ourselves, if these are the symbols of pagans and people that weren't worthy of serious considerations in relationship to God, why have Europeans spent so much time dragging them out of Africa, through the Nile Valley, across the Mediterranean, and then flopping them in their special sacred places and putting a cross on them? This is the type of knowledge we, who are responsible for bringing forth this enormous truth, this is the type of knowledge we have to have. When I go to Rome, and I've been many times, I'll be going through Rome on my way to Ethiopia in 10 days or so. I'll be As the plane flies out, I'll be looking down for the Vatican and looking for that African symbol at the heart of the Vatican. When I go to Paris, and I often go to Paris because je parle très bien le français, presque comme le français. En effet, mes études de doctorat étaient faites en langue française. I'm very fluent in French, so whenever I get a chance and the French Africans get a chance to ask me to come to Paris to participate in conferences and lectures on these issues that we're talking about, because the legacy of Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, one of our greatest scholars, Dr. Diop, D-I-O-P, his family, his son, is in Dakar, and many of the people in Dakar, his wife, but his family, his oldest son, is in Paris. And there are many who are following the tradition of Cheikh Anta Diop as one of the great contributors to this burst of African knowledge. So when I go to Paris, and you, of course, as you would go to Paris, first thing you would want to be able to do is get to the Champs-Élysées, their great boulevard. And at the top of the Champs-Élysées is the Arc de Triomphe, the great Napoleonic arc that's there. And then as you walk down the Champs-Élysées with all the shops and all of the wonderful things to get your money, then you come to the palace of Louis XIV, the great French kings, and you come to the Place de Concorde. And in the Place de Concorde, the place of peace, at the foot of the Champs-Élysées, is an African symbol of rebirth and resurrection, just as there is in the center of the Vatican, the holy place for the Roman Catholic religious faith. And then, when you go to London, along the River Thames is the Parliament, and in front of the Parliament is again a symbol of African rebirth and regeneration and African philosophical thought and deep ideas and understandings and morality and ethical traditions. But don't stop there. You go to Amsterdam, and there is another symbol. You go to Hamburg, and there's another symbol of the African resurrection. You go to Berlin, and there's a symbol. My wife and I, we were in Berlin in November, and there's the symbol. But the largest one, the most significant one, is not the real ones that they took out of Africa, but the artificial one that was built imitating it in Washington, D.C. And right facing this symbol of African resurrection, rebirth, schools of knowledge, is a pillar temple. In Washington, D.C., that pillar temple is a temple to Abraham Lincoln. And that temple to Abraham Lincoln, that pillar temple, was inspired by the temple the Greeks built on the Parthenon, a pillar temple, 450 BC or thereabout, when the Greeks were building a temple to honor their victory over the Persians at Marathon in 490. So they built a great warrior temple, even though the goddess Athena is there. But that temple, 400 or so BC, was inspired by this temple, which was built 1,000 years before it. And this is the great sacred learning center in the Nile Valley. Along the River Nile is this pillar temple of knowledge. Every pillar in the temple, and there are many, reflects a moral and ethical value of the African spiritual tradition of Ma'at. In the great courtyard, there are 44 pillars. 42 of them represent the moral and ethical principles of the famous judgment process, where when you die, your heart is weighed against the feather of truth, Ma'at, and your deeds are recorded as you confess that you have not violated the gods, you have not violated the children, the women, you have not stolen, you have not spoken an evil word. And so as you confess the 42 African affirmations that will allow you to enter into a spiritual life after death. This is the building that's a part of that great tradition. And it was built by a great African family that you know about, but then you haven't made the connections. And that's why I'm saying we got to make the connections. We got to connect the dots. This great pillar temple, where tens of thousands of students, priests, were taught to base their lives on the spiritual traditions of the Nile. This building has inspired not only the Greeks to build the Parthenon, but other institutions around the world have used it as a model, including institutions such as the Rosicrucians, who have their base in San Jose, California, and I happen to have set up the Black Studies Department there in 1969 to 72 before I came back to City College. And the light of the Rosicrucian world and their pillared temples there is the Pharaoh Akhenaten. And so the Pharaoh Akhenaten becomes very important in this process because it was Akhenaten's father and mother that are responsible for expanding this great institution of spiritual learning. As I teach, I use the triangular shape of the sides of the pyramid to process information and data. This will give us another reason to reclaim our pyramids. When you deal with the pyramids is on a square base. And then as you look at the sides of the pyramid, you have a rectangular process and a triangular process. And so I deal with this polarity in reference to thesis, and the thesis begets an antithesis, and the thesis and the antithesis come together to produce a synthesis. This is the formula I use to process all of this enormous information that I'm laying down for my students. Because not only do we need to reclaim the great structures, we need to claim the value systems and the spiritual understandings that was a part of that. So when I refer to the pyramid, I refer to our youngsters mastering the knowledge of thesis and antithesis. Dr. Ben told us very clearly that this references the laws of opposites, and Nile Valley culture was centered on the question of the law of opposites. In life, there is a female principle, and it relates to and begets a male principle. The interaction of the female principle and the male principle produces the synthesis, which is the child. And African deep culture was based upon a trinity of relationships of the female, male, and the child principle, the trinity in the African concepts. These great institutions, like the Karnak temple complex, which is linked to this spiritual complex of learning by a mile of Sphinx. The temple complex at Karnak, the greatest spiritual center in the world, the building of the temples were for the female principle, the male principle, and the child. So you have a temple complex related to the goddess complex Mut, and who was the wife of Amun, and their child was Khonsu. And in the context of the divine relationship in the heavens, you had clearly Aset, which we refer to as Isis in the Greek tradition, but in the African tradition it is Aset. And Aset's husband was Ausar, and Ausar and Aset, as they related and produced a child, the child was Heru. And this Heru principle is a very deep one because Heru becomes the avenger, the child that avenges the death of his father. And in dealing with the death of the father, we also have to relate it to the symbol that we spent a good deal of time talking about. And this is very interesting, and I've just laid out for you that this symbol relates to a numerology. And the numerology relates to the number 14. And in the African deep tradition, represented by these schools of knowledge, God, the Creator, created two sets of humans, 2 males, 2 females. And in one of the deep traditions of the Nile, the 2 sisters married the 2 brothers. And unfortunately, in the tradition, one brother had a child and the other brother was jealous. Now there's different stories in reference to this, but they all relate to the same process. The envy and jealousy that can block spiritual relationships. So this is a symbol of the failed brotherhood. The brother who did not have a child, envy and jealousy led to hate and then destruction and death. So before there was a Cain and Abel story, there was a story of Ausar and his brother Set. And so these 2 married couples had a disaster and a tragedy that they had to deal with. And the female principle came together to form a sisterhood of life and resurrection and rebirth. So this deep symbol is a symbol of the success of the female principle in resurrecting life and the tragedy of the conflict that the male has in sustaining his role. And so the brother who was on the evil side of the issue eliminated his brother and cut him up into 14 pieces. So one of the parables goes, the teaching story goes. And the 14 pieces were scattered around the Nile. The sisters didn't go into conflict. They went into sisterhood. And they were able to pull a miracle. They went throughout the Nile Valley, found the cut-up pieces of Osiris. That's the Greek name, Ausar, the African name. And they were able to resurrect the brother who had died. But there was one major obstacle they had, and it was that the Nile catfish had eaten the male part. So the female principle, which is the principle of regeneration, rebirth, nurturing, they faced this great obstacle of how do we handle the death of the good brother and then not being able to recoup that private part. So the women had commissioned out of the living rock of the Nile a symbol of the erect penis to complete the resurrection of Osiris. Now we need to understand that this principle of numbers, 13 and 14, 13 is considered an unlucky number. 14 is considered the number of a special sacred number. So this nation in its founding was not the right number. We had 13 colonies in America. So you can't found it on the wrong number. So they were into the African tradition. So they had commissioned out of the land from Virginia and the land from Maryland, land that they created a square, and in that square, they named it the District of Columbia. A black man, Benjamin Banneker, laid out the square that became Washington, D.C. And the highest thing in Washington, D.C. is a symbol of this resurrective principle. That's the Washington Monument. Our impact on the world is enormous, and we need to begin to see it. Now, this process of rebirth and regeneration and teaching and building monumentally, building for eternity, is not something that just reached its zenith in Egypt. It has been a part of in Kemet. It has been a part of a process that continues even to this day. This is the symbol of Queen T, or Ty, T-Y, or T-I-Y-E. She, with her great husband, Amenhotep III, built the great temple complex of Luxor, expanded it. She ruled with him with equal majesty for 38 years, I believe. And then when he passed on, she continued the rulership There's a period in the history called the Amana period, where her son built a new city of God, and she was with the son in this period. He moved out of the city of Waset, which was later called Thebes, and at some point, and now is called Luxor. This city was overwhelmed with the wealth and the power of the Egyptian might and the conquest of other nations, that it appears that there was a pollution occurring in the value system. So her son, following the father in a spiritual way of building these great institutions, her son said, we're going to leave the great city of Thebes, Waset, and we're going to build a new city of God, Tel Amarna. And then there was a period of letters which great rulers wrote to this great woman. This woman, 1400 BC, she's ruling on the throne of Egypt, and 40 or so years later, she's still ruling. They wrote letters to her to please keep the relationship between the Nile Valley, Kemet, and us. Now, there's been some question as to whether she's African. I have no question about the Africanness. She's clearly African. But the Africans of the Nile Valley were African. As time goes on and the invaders come, you're talking about a period of 5,000 years. 4100 BC is when one of the chronologies, they date the development of the calendars, the lunar calendar, the solar calendar, and the stellar calendar, based upon the moon, the sun, and the stars. And so 3100 BC, the political process solidified, and you had the upper and lower Egypt uniting. So you had the beginning of this studying the Nile Valley and its overflow, building an economics around it. So you had the three components of a system that the Africans have laid on the world. The system involves economics, the productive capability, politics, the management capability, and culture, the cement that keeps things together. That's the great contribution of Africans of the Nile. Because of the blessed ecology of the flooding of the Nile and the fertile soil, they were able to master how you take destruction and make it a part of a positive process. When the Nile overflows its banks, everything is destroyed. But there's a renewal of life. And so they were able to take the destructive process of the Nile flooding and make it into a renewal. So they had an economic system that they highly developed, and you needed a political system to manage it, and you needed a cultural system to sustain it. So when you look at the African culture that I try to talk about, you're talking about three great eras of history: the Old Kingdom, the Pyramid Age; the Middle Kingdom, where the great writings and whatnot, the scientific treaties took place; and then you have the New Kingdom, which was again a period of renewal of the traditions. And this is in Kemet. But Kemet also related to the southern part of the Nile, and so these traditions passed down to Nubia. And most of us don't realize that there are more pyramids in Nubia, smaller in size, and built 2,000 years after the Great Pyramids of Giza. But the pyramid process is very important in Nubia. And so recently, when they came out with a newspaper article on the lost pharaohs of Nubia, and my partners and I did a DVD on the renewal of this tradition. You had it emerge in the Old Kingdom, 500 years of glory. You had it renewed in the Middle Kingdom, another great period of great African wealth. And here are the leaders of the Middle Kingdom. This is Amenhotep II. This is Amenemhep III. His blood ruled the Nile for 200 years. These were people who, again, went through the process of renewal of the tradition. And then, after a period of invasion and the invaders come in, again, the Africans renew their culture. This is the New Kingdom leader, Ahmes Nefertari, who came up from the south, and then throughout the invaders that had come in through the north, through the Mediterranean, and they reestablished greatness. So this process of continuous renewal and reestablishing of greatness is a part of the Nile. And I'll just leave you with three images that are very important. King Tut, we know about, but we don't link him to the royal family. Akhenaten, we know about because he married Nefertiti, but the most important person in the family is Queen T, and she is not a part of the equation. She arranged for the marriage of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And she helped to lay the foundations for the boy king, Tutankhamun. Why is this African woman kept out of the picture? But clearly, images. Whoever controls the image, this is clearly an African woman, and there'll be no question of the source of the greatness. But the thing that I want to leave you with is that this tradition, subject to invasions from the Libyans and from the Sea People, was renewed once again in one great moment of enormous history, and that was by the Nubians in the south. They came up from the south where these temples and these institutions that had been built in the north were renewed in the south. This is the Holy Mount, and at the foot of the Holy Mount are 7 temples, similar to the temples at Luxor. And one of the great temples is the Temple of Amun, like the temple at Luxor refers to Amun. It extends out from the mountain. The female temple extends into the mountain in the tradition of the makeup of male and female. The male participation in life is the Felix, and it extends out. And so there was a similar temple to the Pillar Temple in Luxor at the foot of this mountain. And then there was next to it was a female temple to the goddess Hathor. And so the royal births took place inside the mountain, so that when that child was born, and in his early stages, he is brought out, or she is brought out, from having a royal birth in the mountain, because Amun represents the manifestation of God. And so the Karnak Temple complex is considered the northern abode of God, and the Holy Mount in Nubia is considered the southern abode of God. And so the relationship between the south and the north, Nubia and Egypt, Kemet, and the Sudan, I had a chance to see in its fullness, and it was a glorious moment for me to be able to see the cultural link between the north and the south. It's one great 1,000, 2,000 mile ribbon of civilization, the likes of which does not exist anywhere. And then the temples in Nubia were many, but they were not as large because they didn't have the granite rock to build as they had in the Giza Plateau. And this is myself in Nubia at one of the restored temples. The entranceway, the burial is in the under the pyramid, and the Italians, discoverers or adventurers, knocked off the tops looking for jewelry and whatnot. But this is the great image I want to leave you with. This is Dr. J, and when you see the many pyramids in Nubia, there are over 380 of them, and there's myself holding up a black power fist in front of the Nubian pyramids. And then one of the great stories that's not told is Taharqa. Pianke, his father, Shabaka, his uncle, led one of the greatest historical moments in the world, 800 BC, in the renewal of Nile Valley culture. They saw the invasion and the prostitution of Egypt, Kemet, and so they had a spiritual mission to restore Africa to its greatness. And so they went up the Nile Valley, and over the next year, they really had an Iliad and Odyssey of historical African development. At that time, Homer was writing the Iliad and Odyssey, which is a myth about legends and whatnot, monsters and whatnot. But in real time, these African warriors conquered city after city. And it wasn't just for conquest, it was for restoration. And in each of the cities, they restored the temples, they restored the significant sacred places. And so this is an example of African warriors moving up the Nile and conquering city after city. This is a historical moment. 2,700 years ago, these pharaohs from Nubia who conquered and linked Nubia and the Nile, the only time it was done in that fashion, these pharaohs were buried in Kerma so that they would not be destroyed by the invaders coming in from the north. And they were broken up systematically so they could be hidden, but they also could be restored. This is the restored images of these pharaohs of the Nubian dynasty, one of the greatest moments in history, a real living odyssey. And I'm going to try to write about it. I'm trying to talk about it because it reverberates in my heart. In fact, I'm working on a docudrama. Pianke, the initiator of the renewal process, and Shabaka, his brother, who continued it, and Taharqa, the son of Pianke, who was a part of it. And in fact, Taharqa is mentioned in the Bible because not only did they conquer the whole Nile, they went up to Syria and into Israel. But the interesting part of the docudrama is they were discovered in the fall of 2003. So there's a relationship between the young Taharqa talking to his uncle, Shabaka, saying, Unc, when are we going to make a move? We've been here underground for 2,700 years. Don't you think it's time for us to show and tell? And his uncle says, well, I think you're right. Let me talk to my big brother, your father, and see what he says. And so he talks to Pianke, and Pianke says, I think it's time for us to make a move. I've heard from the African grapevine that there's going to be a young African from America who's going to be coming this way. And I think some good things are going to happen. So within 3 months after these remains of these statues were brought up out of the ground by a Swiss team that had been in that area for 30 years, within 3 months in February of 2004, Dr. Jeffries was there. And as you know, we have a DVD and everything in reference to the trip to Nubia, and it is now circulated around the world. Wherever I go, people tell me about the Nubian imagery that I was able to bring forth. And so I have been able to give these brothers a place in the world. There are more queens in Nubia than there are kings and pharaohs. So the female component was very significant. And so you've got to see the link between Nubia and Kemet, between the north and the south, the interfertilization. Even if there was a period of domination or conquest of one over another, it's within the context of an African family and a context of civilization that runs for thousands of miles. There is nothing like it in the world, in any other part of the world. There have been great civilizations and great developments, but nothing that deals so quickly and so clearly with an economic foundation that allowed millions of people to be properly taken care of, a political foundation that allowed political processes to take place, that develop what we refer to as the laws of opposites, or the upper relating to the lower, in other words, and making the cultures work to each other. For example, in the Nile Valley cultures, you have the lotus plant as one symbol in one geographical area, and then the papyrus as another symbol, another geographical area. In the Nubian crowns, they have the upper and lower. So they developed a political sophistication where even different geographical areas and maybe a different ethnicity related to each other and interrelated to it. It is one of the greatest stories of African peoples in the history of the world. Taharqa was so fascinated by the greatness of the Nile when he made that, continued what his father had started, that he came back to Nubia. He had already had a pyramid built. He enlarged it 3 times. And so that interrelationship of greatness from one part of Africa in relationship to another part of Africa in the Nile Valley is clearly there. There are no Europeans involved. There are no Swedes. There are no people out of the desert involved. There are no... they're African peoples, if I can say that. And just let me leave you with that. That process of renewal and rebirth, that process of taking the traditions and renewing them continues today. Last month, my wife and I had a chance to go back to Africa again. We went this time with 100 of the leaders of Black America, invited by the president of Senegal, who has said that the time for rebirth of African peoples is now. And that time for rebirth, he symbolizes with this great imagery. A statue larger than the Statue of Liberty, larger than the statue of Jesus the Redeemer in Rio de Janeiro, has been built representing the African family, the rebirth of the African family, the renaissance of the African family. This is the statue to the African Renaissance. It's an enormous thing. Inside the volcano, the family emerges out of the volcano, and there are museums and historical centers in this lower level. And you can go up into the head of the African man who is pulling his family together. You can go up into the head of it, take an elevator, and look out to the world. And as you look out to the world, and this is an example of the stairway where thousands of youngsters were when we were there. And as you look out to the world, you see this young man. The father is holding on to the foundation of the African family, which is the woman. And he's a bedrock himself. And then you have the young child. And the hand is pointing to, the finger is pointing not north to Europe, not east to Asia, not south to Africa. It's pointing west to the Western Hemisphere. The statement being that will be the unity of Africans in the Western Hemisphere with unity on the continent, which will produce a true African Renaissance. So there's a reason for us to get into this knowledge. It's not to get degrees, it's not to get, but it's to know the truth of our role in our destiny. And that role in that destiny is an enormous thing. One last item, when you take the pyramid and you use it to process information and data, the triangular side of the pyramid, you have the African foundation and legacy. And that goes back with several generations and several eras of golden ages. The Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom. I use the Queen T age to represent a 50-year turning point of history of a renewal of African culture, 1400 BC to 1350 BC. There's no European reading or writing. There's no European high culture. There's no European, when this black woman is a part of the renewal of African culture. But then you have the opposite, law of opposites. At another period, 1400 AD, 1482 to be exact, you have the European establishing a slave post on the west coast of Africa. 1492, Columbus sailing across the ocean. And within that 50-year turning point of history, you have history that turns against African peoples. And the European began to put his system of economics centered on slavery and exploitation, politics centered on the new nations, and the culture of white supremacy. So that 500 years leads to a 500-year domination of the European, and that's what we're dealing with today. But since 1945, you go to the top of that pyramid, since 1945 to 1995 and beyond, we're in the awakening of peoples of color. It's our great time now. And the AAA, I refer to it as Africans, Southern Asians, and Indigenous Americans. And that AAA is emerging. 1945, Africans met in London at the Manchester Conference and began to envision a new world, a new possibility of African self-government and African development. And then they began to go home, and Nkrumah Azikiwe of Nigeria, and Nkrumah of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Padmore from Trinidad and Tobago went and joined Nkrumah. W.E.B. Du Bois was there. All of these minds met to envision a new African world, and they began to lay the foundations for taking control of African economics, putting in a political structure, and developing a culture of us as a Pan-African global family. 45 was the Manchester Conference. 46 was the Indonesians doing the same thing. They were claiming their world and told the Dutch, take your wood shoes and get out of here. We have the weapons you gave us to fight the Japanese, and we're prepared to fight you. Independence of Indonesia, 46. 47, India becomes independent, led by Mahatma Gandhi. And 48, Palestine, Israel. 49, the People's Republic of China. In the 50s, 52, Gamal Nasser Naguib. For the first time, black people are ruling in Egypt for 2,000 years. 53, Mossadegh. 54, Dien Bien Phu. 55, the Bandung Conference. 55, movement in the southern parts of the United States. Emmett Till, Rosa Parks, the Montgomery Booker. 56, the Sudan. 57, Ghana. 58, Guinea. 59, Cuba. In the 60s, many independent African nations, a movement in America, the sit-in movements and the student movements, which eventually led to the Black Power conferences, eventually led to Black Studies. That has continued in the 70s with the Portuguese nations becoming independent. In the 80s, Zimbabwe. In the 90s, Namibia and South Africa. So we're on a glorious path. We got to begin to understand it and make our contribution. This symbol of the resurrection and rebirth really speaks to the history that we are actually experiencing. So brothers and sisters, it's up to you. Self-development means knowledge and empowerment, so you have to tap into this knowledge and grow, and then make your contribution, develop a sacred mission to add to this great history. Madasi P. Many thanks.
Wow, that was incredible. Thank you so much.
Well, it's
Tuwa, as our ancient Kemetic ancestors would say.
It's my pleasure, and today is my wife's birthday, so I want to dedicate it to having a partner for more than 45 years.
Wonderful.
Incredible.
That has been with me every step of the way. In fact, she initiated it in 1960. She went to Africa, to Nigeria. Then in 1961, I went. Then we met. And eventually, we got married in 64. And then we went to live in Africa for 2 years as I did my PhD. And so that it's good to have somebody to share this with.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
so
That's
we
right.
got
That's
to
right.
build the African family.
That's right. That's the only way you'd be able to do this for as long as you've done it.
Exactly.
Is to have the support and have someone that's actually alongside you doing it with you.
That's right. And my mother
Right.
has, when she was alive, she went to Africa with us. She went to Ghana. She went to Egypt. She was Eastern Star, so she knew that when she was going to Egypt, she was going to be lifted up. And then my nephews, Hassan and Hakeem, they went as 12 and 13-year-olds.
Wow.
And now they're lawyers and professors, etc. So there's this history, once you get into it, you get motivated.
That's right.
And you understand, you redefine yourself. See, we have been for too long defined by the enemy. And the attack on me during this time is a perfect example. I'm none of what I've been pictured as. And that's what we were complaining about. Africa is not what you've pictured us in the movies or in the books. We need to know the truth.
Right.
And so I've been able to stand strong because I stand on the truth.
That's right.
And we don't have to ridicule people. We don't have to devastate people with a lie, but we have to handle the truth. And
That's right.
So that's going to be difficult for us because our Italian friends are going to be mad when we talk about Christopher Columbus. Our Jewish friends are going to be mad when we say, look, the pyramids, the Jewish people have done many great things, and they're part of this enormous awakening of the human experience, but we want our pyramids back. And when we talk about the Statue of Liberty having nothing to do with immigrants, it has to do with the struggle for real liberty.
That's
And
right.
the Frenchmen who called for the statue were people who, Edward René Lefebvre de la Boulaye was the head of the French Anti-Slave
That's
Society.
right.
There's
An abolitionist,
There's no
a well-known
way
abolitionist.
he could have called for a monument to America, and there's 4 million Africans enslaved
That's
in
right.
America.
Definitely.
So it was the struggle against slavery that initiated the Statue of Liberty process, and then they don't allow us to have
That's been erased.
anything. And it's
Erased.
still going on as
That's
we
right.
speak.
Yes.
That's
you
right.
know?
Yes.
So that's why we have to make our claims and make them bold.
That's right.
That's why I make them bold. I want my pyramids back, and the Washington Monument doesn't have anything to do with Washington.
That's right.
And
That's right.
and
That's
we put
right.
it on DVD.
Yeah.
So we're not bitter. When I go around the world talking to people and students, I say, don't be mad, be glad. Don't be sad, be prepared. Forget about the looks and get into the books. Stop worrying about the behind and get into your African mind. Now, this is before the young men started dropping their pants. So
Oh, boy.
I was saying
This is
this
a pet
20,
peeve of
20
Anika
years
for
ago.
mine.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, it
And
is.
no great people can go forth with their young people showing their behind. There's no way that they can go forth and do what they have to do. These great men went forth because they had behind them African armies.
That's right.
This is what men do.
That's
They
right.
protect their people.
That's right.
And how are you going to protect your people and you got to waddle through the street and you're concerned with matching up your drawers and not with matching up your mind with the greatness that has gone on before us. And so,
And of course, we always forget that as these great rulers come forth, before the coronation to cement their position in Kemet, in what they consider the South, but we consider the North today,
Yes.
they wait for the coronation so that their mother can come
Yes.
forth
Right.
And so we've been set so far out of balance in
So that
understanding the
it's
importance of family.
inconceivable for the Africans who laid the foundation for civilization and culture, and Africans involved in great cultural development now, to denigrate the female principle.
That's right.
There's no way that B's and H's could be a part of the consciousness. But somehow that we've gone astray, somebody has recognized our greatness. We're born to win, but we're programmed to lose. And clearly, as our young men, that prison culture has come out on the streets. Now it's spread worldwide.
That's right.
And somebody programmed that.
Yeah.
And somebody's making money off of that.
Right.
And our young people don't see how they're crippled.
That's
Now,
right.
how can you go through your neighborhood, you have maybe your little child and your wife and your mother with you. If somebody came up on you, you couldn't lift up your leg to give them a karate kick. You bonded yourself with your belt over your thigh.
Nor could you run.
Yes.
I mean, neither
Yes.
of those things
You
could
couldn't-
happen.
So we've got to change that
That's right.
consciousness because someone else has controlled the images.
That's right.
Whoever controls the images controls the self-esteem, the self-respect, and the self-development. We're into arrested development. Write it down. We are into arrested development because a negative self-esteem exists that black people look at each other and they want to be white. They look at each other and they want to be light. They look in the mirror like Michael Jackson. The most talented family probably
That's
in the
right.
history of the world
Yeah.
was bedeviled by a lack of appreciating their
That's right.
Africanness.
That's right.
And so that's a teaching moment in reference to Michael, that he had this broad nose, full lips. He had melanin. That was his blessing.
That's right.
And he didn't realize it.
No.
And there was in the family this lack of appreciation and understanding. So if we want to take our blessings and make them work for us, we got to appreciate internally who we are and relate it to the greatness of outside of us.
That's right.
Which
That's
is
right.
the master plan and the creation.
Well,
have
we've been
two.
stingy. We've been
Yes, we
taking
have two.
advantage
That's
of him,
right,
and
that's
we have
right.
audience
We
members
have
who are
audience
sitting at the
members
edge
who
of
wanna
their
ask some questions
chairs
really
with
quickly.
questions.
So why don't we do that really quickly, Dr.
Okay.
J, if we can. Can we go with ladies first?
Yes.
I see, even though we know that our brother had a question to ask quickly, he was deferring as well. So, Sister Fatima, your question, please.
Thank you. Dr. Jeffries, once again, you pretty much noted earlier about the sacredness of the feminine principle and the fact that the feminine principle is regeneration, resurrection, and so on and so forth. Queen Ty ruling after her husband's death. As a woman who's very passionate about our ancient Kemetic legacy as well, and knowing how dominated women are today
Yes.
by patriarchal ideologies, I want to be a part adamantly with my brothers, but how do I put forth the restoration of the sacred feminine principle in order to restore balance today and to resurrect our ancient legacies?
You know, I like that question.
Well, one of the great potentiality in the question is that women control. Women rule. That's in the nature of things. You are wired by the Creator to be the nurturer. You are wired to bond. So that African symbol of the women bonding and creating a sisterhood of life as opposed to going at each other's throat like the brothers did. Men are not wired. We're not wired to produce children. You can nibble on my little breast as long as you will. It won't produce any nourishment, maybe titillation, but not any any nutrients for life. And so we have to understand the reality of the female principle. It is the female principle who can carry a life in her body and then sustain it out of the body. And so we have to understand that men have to be formed to appreciate and understand their special role. Women have it by nature, but it has to be developed. And that's unfortunately the problem. You raise us. You instill the values. You call the men to order. And so you don't understand what power you have. My wife can look at me, and I know I better straighten up and fly back. All the attacks I've had on me, my mother, just when she said one thing, I remember years ago, and she said, "You're like your uncle." And I said, oh my goodness, that was the worst thing that she could possibly say, because he was, he was the youngest, he was the baby of the group, he wasn't serious, etc. I'm like her father. I was born on her father's birthday. She crafted me like a father, who was the Pan-Africanist, who came up from the South. He had Booker T. Washington in him. He came up from the South. He had Marcus Garvey in him. He had W.E.B. Du Bois. And so just one word from my mother devastated me. And for a week, I was dislocated. I finally looked in the mirror and said, "You're not what your mother said you are. You know who you are. Get back on track." And that's why when the attack came, the greatest attack in the history of the world on me after 9, they started really 2 years before I responded at the Albany speech. They started this attack, and it was because they can't allow this truth to be a part of the human development. It has to be. We can't see Africans as lesser than. It is from Africans, and Diop's great work is the victory. We have to see Africans as the mother and father of the human family. And in Diop's great work, Civilization, Barbarism, which I got money to help translate, the 3 elements of our victory, the intellectual warfare has been won by our people. This is Dr. Jacob Carruthers. And when you use that pyramidal form again, there is an origin of the human family. There's an evolution of the human family, and there's a cradle of civilization of the human family. That origin is African, that evolution is African, and that cradle of civilization is African. And so we have to understand where we stand. We don't take a backseat to anybody. Everybody comes through us. And once you understand that, then we can really take our role. But the women have to understand that they are central and crucial. To it. Yes.
Thank you so much.
That's a P.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We have one more quick question.
Dr. Jeffries, that was a fantastic
Yes, brother.
presentation. And
Thank
I
you.
found one really important question that always touches me is, what from your studies is the contribution that the Nubian civilization has had in the religion of Islam, specifically within the Shia of faith? Because I know that out of the 12 imams, many of them were actually had Nubian mothers, and their Nubian ancestry was saying that was struggling and forced. But however, you see what's happening now, the same thing that's happening in Christianity with the Europeanization of Jesus. You're seeing it within Islam itself. So what is your perspective on this?
This sounds like a tough
I
question
know
to
that
answer
you.
quickly,
No,
isn't it?
I don't expect you to. That's another lecture. I'll be in here next week to lecture. But the role of the Nubians in the world needs to be reviewed and looked at. And just as the role of the Nubians in relationship to the Nile Valley has to be firmed up, the role of the Nubians in relationship to the revealed traditions needs to be understood. Because when you're talking about the revealed traditions, you're talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And the Nubian had a role in that. The ancient Hebrews, the relationship between Ethiopia and the traditions of Ethiopia relate to the ancient Hebrew traditions.
That's right.
And in the emergence of Christianity, Christianity does not come out of Italy or England or Germany or France. It comes out of Africa, the first Christian nation being in Africa. Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia have this deep tradition. So we need to see, and of course you can't talk about the Prophet Muhammad without his relationship to the Nubians that were a part of his contribution to this understanding of the divine. The great difficulty is that in order for other people to emerge, they felt the need to devastate the African. And as a result, instead of raising up the African and see the African as a part of the sharing of this consciousness, there has been a destruction of African humanity. That's what slavery was. I'm talking about slavery going across that desert, the North African slavery. I'm talking about slavery in the Indian Ocean, which was around the Arab, the Persian peoples. And I'm talking about slavery in the transatlantic. And so our great role, and we can do it with a smile, because we are standing on this enormous truth, is to bring this truth to bear. So that these great religious traditions move off a failed process of centering it on the male and marginalizing the female. And unless there is this complementarity of the male and the female, with the female centered properly, we won't be able to have the flowering of the human family like we should. Using that pyramid again and putting the self in the knowledge, because I want our students to know that they are part of history and their families are part of history. So I say, in the beginning, using the pyramid, there was the mother that allowed the father to have his way, and they interrelated, and there was good sex. And then the mother is the thesis, the father is the opposite, the antithesis. And after good sex, there will be a child, and that's the synthesis. And how does the science work in that? The mother contributes 23, the father contributes 23, and the 46 come together in the child. 46 chromosomes is when you start. Now, we got to understand that process. But the development takes place within the female. The male makes his contribution, but it is centered in the female.
That's right.
That's a universal understanding that we've got to begin to understand.
Right.
And then if we expand these cultures with that, then we won't have these cultures that are war cultures, dominant cultures. And so I think we got work to do. And we can do it. The knowledge is there.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks again for the award. Thank you. And with that, folks, comes to end another wonderful episode of Kemetic Legacy today.
But the struggle continues.
Yes.
Intellectual warfare.
It has to be waged.
Each of us has to wage it with ourselves.
That's right.
And with our families, with our communities, and bonding together with others so that we can make it a global process.
And as I call Dr. Jeffries one of our warrior scholars, you clearly, if you weren't familiar with him before, you understand why I gave him that title before. I'm not the first one to call him that either.
No, and
so definitely.
In fact, it is a struggle.
Yes.
And you have to be on a war footing. And so when the attack came on me, the greatest attack in the history of the modern world against a professor, I was ready for it.
That's right.
I've never flinched. I've never.
That's right.
And my wife has been by my side. My brother has been on my other side. His children have been with him. My mother. All the churches and all religious traditions have supported me.
That's right. That's right.
See?
That's
and
right.
people would be surprised at how many Jewish folks have sent books and material that this is what you need in this argument, in this enormous truth that you're dealing with. So it's helped to keep me even keel.
Balanced.
Right. Because when you see them comparing me to Hitler, I go to the University of Syracuse, and in the student newspaper there's a cartoon with a scale, and on one side is Hitler, and one side is Len Jeffries, and it's a question of who is the worst.
Wow.
So luckily those are so devastating that you can't accept them.
Right.
I can't accept the definition of the enemy of me. I know who I am. I know what my mission, my purpose is.
Right.
I am on a sacred mission, just as all of us have to have, to adding to the creation, the divine.
We're going to have you back to have a full interview.
That's right.
And talk to you more. You've given us a wonderful lecture, but we want to talk to you more about what this journey has meant to you.
No problem.
And we'd be remiss without saying thank you to Queen Jeffries
That's
for
right.
letting you be here
That's right.
on
That's
her
right.
Earth
That's
Day.
right.
Because I know we would probably get a flogging for doing that. But I can tell that she understands the importance of sharing this knowledge as well,
That's
for
right.
allowing you to be out here
Yes.
on her Earth Day.
And
So
also, as we
thank you
close,
so
Sister,
much.
also thank you to Sister Imani Scott, who helped us get in
Oh
contact.
yes, Sister Money has worked.
Who has been on the show
Yes.
before and will continue to be part of the work that we're doing as well.
In fact,
So-
my wife is glad that I've made my contribution, but she'll look me in the eye and say, you know, this is my area of expertise. And so she's writing, she's at the computer now, writing
She'll be
a book.
next.
So,
Wow.
and she's gotten her PhD from Yale University.
Wow.
And they invited her up there so that they could pick her brain, because she's one of the leading experts in the world on African and African American, African Caribbean culture. And so we really have an effective combination, because I deal with the
Partnership, that's
economics
right.
and the politics. She deals with the culture and the psychology. And
Right.
so it really works for us.
Wow. 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 Tuwa, we have to give you divine thanks. And once again, folks, this was an incredible episode. You have a lot more to look forward to, because I know that when Dr. Jeffries is back in town, we'll want to have him back on and talk with him at further
About
length.
his trips.
That's right.
And Twalu, thank you to our studio audience. Thank you to our audience at home. Please remember, drop us a message, give us a comment on Facebook. Let us know how you feel about our episode. And also add to our comments in terms of what you'd like to see on our show, Kemetic Legacy Today. So with that, the divine force in us greets the divine force in you. Uncle Jasaneb.
Uncle Jasaneb.
Life, strength, and health. Thank you for
Etefel.
tuning in to Kemetic Legacy Today.